In the years leading up to Nelson Mandela's election, it often seemed that South Africa would erupt into bloody civil war. Close to half a century of apartheid had sapped the spirit of the country's black majority, leaving in its wake a bitter resolve. Now the rest of the world was isolating the white regime through economic sanctions. South Africa was a powerful bomb with a lit fuse. The African National Congress had taken up the armed struggle in 1961 under Commander-in-Chief Nelson Mandela. They had turned to force only after protesting peacefully for 50 years against the political system imposed upon them by white South Africa. Apartheid had concentrated all the political and economic power into the hands of the whites, who were just 1/5 of South Africa's population. When the blacks tried to protest, the government crushed them. The African National Congress and its allies, the Pan-African Congress and the South African Communist Party, were banned. The ANC's leadership believed that the armed struggle was their last resort.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
In 1964, Mandela had been sentenced to life in prison for attempting to overthrow the state. 20 years later, the police and the security forces struck out at anyone who advocated freeing Mandela.
The National Party say we don't deal with terrorism and we don't deal with perpetrators of violence. The ANC is committed to violence at this moment, is actually implementing a policy of violence, is continuously making itself guilty of acts of violence.
In 1985, with Mandela still in prison, violence against the apartheid system was escalating. Government suppression of the outlawed African National Congress was growing ever more brutal. In public, the ruling National Party appeared to be digging in their heels. But behind the scenes, something quite different was occurring. Two enemies who had publicly declared they would not negotiate began talking to each other. This is the story of the secret meetings and backroom deals that averted a bloodbath in South Africa and that led to Nelson Mandela's election as president. It is also one of the most amazing political stories in this or any other century. Violent death was becoming a way of life as insurgents challenged government security forces more and more frequently. By 1985, the international community was applying increasing pressure for an end to apartheid and for Nelson Mandela to be released. He had been in prison for 22 years. President Botha proposed what seemed like a clever deal.
I am prepared to release Mr. Mandela if he would say that he rejects violence as a means to reach and to achieve political ends.
In Pollsmoor prison, Mandela drafted his reply to President Botha's offer and passed it to his daughter Zinzi.
My father says, I cannot and will not give any undertaking at a time when I and you, the people, are not free. Your freedom and mine cannot be separated. I will return. Amanda!
Mr. Mandela's daughter, at a public rally, announced the non-acceptance of the offer. Mr. Botha summoned me to his office, and he said to me, you know, we have painted ourselves into a corner. Can you get us out?
Botha's problem now was that he couldn't release Mandela without losing face. Anti-apartheid activists, believing they had the government on the run, were in no mood to negotiate.
We should fight to a point where the regime begs for mercy, and when they beg for mercy, then we can begin to negotiate. We would then know that we are in a stronger position. If you negotiate when your enemy is still strong, you are likely to make too many compromises.
The Black Uprising was not only causing turmoil throughout the country, it also alarmed South Africa's trading partners. In August of 1985, American banks began withdrawing short-term capital from South Africa. As internal tensions increased, the president's security advisors privately relayed to him their anxiety.
Security actions alone was like sitting on a pot full of water with the fires around the pot, and we were sitting on the lid of that pot. It was not going to solve it permanently, it was only a temporary thing.
With her husband in prison, Winnie Mandela became one of the most prominent symbols of the anti-apartheid struggle. She frequently attracted the attention of the security forces.
I know what arrest means. Don't threat me.
At the end of 1985, she flew to Cape Town to visit her husband after he had had an operation.
Mr. Kubikusie was flying back to Cape Town. I was on the same plane.
I looked up and there was Mrs. Mandela, a very imposing personality. I removed the briefcase, she sat down, and we started to chat.
Mr. Kusie said he was very happy to meet me personally and that he had had a great deal. I said, obviously, because you are the man who has banned and house arrested me.
I invited her to my official residence in Cape Town, where she was received by my wife and by myself.
I knew he would record me, so I also took precautions. I went to sit on his couch. For some odd reason, he said, no, I don't think you will be comfortable there. I think you should sit under the window. That made me, of course, suspicious.
I asked Mrs. Mandela not to sit opposite the window for security reasons.
I opened my handbag, I took out a tissue and wiped myself, and I was in fact switching on the tape recorder.
Later on, I heard that Mrs. Mandela was under the impression that I had taped her, and she therefore reciprocated very kindly by taping me.
He said those of them who were inclined to be liberal could not even begin influencing the government about the release of political prisoners, because we were making things difficult for them. As long as the African National Congress was violent in its approach, there was no question of even thinking about the release of political prisoners.
The Minister of Justice followed up his chat with Winnie Mandela by paying a surreptitious visit to her husband in the hospital.
I found in him actually a surprising accessibility. I found him a very amiable person.
He hinted at the possibility of the ANC and the government sitting down to sort out the problems of the country. But it was done very discreetly.
I decided to trust him. And later on I got the impression he also made up his mind to trust me.
When I met Mandela at the hospital ward, he informed me of what the effect of his message to Coetzee was. Don't regard me as part of the problem. Regard me as part of the solution.
When we spoke to Mrs. Mandela yesterday, we asked her about reports that she and her husband had met the Minister of Justice. She told us that that matter would be clarified.
We know nothing about that.
Can you deny that it's taken?
We know nothing about that, sir.
When Mandela returned from the hospital, the authorities had a surprise for him.
When I went back to prison, the commanding officer came to fetch me, and along the way he then said to me, "You are not going back to your friends. We are taking you to a separate section of the prison."
Mandela had always believed the ANC struggle would be resolved by negotiations, but many of his colleagues in prison opposed talking to the enemy. Now he could pursue his own strategy.
Immediately in my mind, I said, well, this will be a good opportunity for me actually to start negotiations with the government and to be able to maintain this element of secrecy.
Mandela's secret talks with the government began as rebellion erupted throughout the country. The white regime saw the ANC as part of a total communist onslaught against South Africa. Terrorist bombs and guerrillas coming across the borders were presented as evidence that the ANC was under the control of international communism.
The ANC was at that moment combined with the South African Communist Party. A lot of the Communist Party members who were top officials in the ANC hierarchy. At that stage in South Africa, we were fighting a war. Most of us did military training, were officers in the army, fought against them in Angola, in Namibia, with the Cubans around there, Cubans being supplied by the Russians. The bombs that exploded in South Africa was Russian-made bombs. AK-47s were killing people, so communism and Russia was a very real threat.
As matters now stand, the two organizations are now so interwoven that no one can enter into discussions with the ANC without the knowledge that he is probably also in discussion with the South African Communist Party.
Banned in South Africa, the ANC broadcast its uncompromising message from exile in Zambia.
Is Radio Freedom, the voice of the African National Congress, to spearhead the people's struggle for the seizure of power from the oppressors.
We needed to get into a stronger position before we engaged in serious discussions with the government. We have to make apartheid unworkable and our country ungovernable. The accomplishment of these tasks will create the situation for us to overthrow the apartheid regime and for power to pass into the hands of the people as a whole. Correctly, we concentrated on the weakest link in the apartheid chain of command and control. For months, we have maintained an uninterrupted offensive against the puppet local government authorities.
Blacks suspected of collaborating with the apartheid regime were attacked, driven from the townships, and even murdered.
We had the uprisings of 1984, and we had to keep this mood of resistance building up in the country moving forward. We had to escalate the struggle. If he took the position that negotiations are a possibility, it would immobilize us.
Mandela, isolated from his colleagues, began to act independently. In the prison commissioner's house on the grounds of Polesmore, a series of talks began.
If you are a member of an organization and your comrades say, don't do this, whatever your views are, in a collective leadership, that you have to accept, and that is what I feared. So I wanted to confront them with a fait accompli.
We started to talk about how to normalize things, how to normalize politics in South Africa.
President Botha instructed Justice Minister Coetzee to appoint a committee to meet with Mandela in the strictest secrecy. They held 47 meetings over 4 years. This committee included the top men in the National Intelligence Service.
I had spent an agonizing period because although I was prepared to talk to members of the government, I was not prepared to talk to a master spy.
Our job was really to find out how his mind was working, how he was perceiving the situation in the country, what sort of plans did he have.
The ANC leaders in exile were not sure what Mandela was up to. He found a way to smuggle a message to them.
I wrote a short note to Comrade Oliver Tambo, then president of the ANC, and I informed him that I was having discussions.
The natural reaction of most of our membership was one of suspicion at the news that negotiations had begun.
The concern was, if Comrade Mandela is talking to the regime on the quiet, is it not possible that he is at such a disadvantage that he will be maneuvered into a trap?
I got a very sharp response from Oliver Tambo, in which he said, "What exactly are you discussing with these people?" I thought I should be tough, and I just replied, "A meeting between the government and the ANC to discuss the situation in the country, full stop."
The African National Congress commands and urges all of us to act for unity and, as one, let this be the year of the most powerful offensive against the apartheid regime and its puppets.
Even the desire
President Botha continued to act as though talks with Mandela were unthinkable.
The ANC has on various occasions emphasized that it is not interested in the renunciation of violence, but that it will continue its onslaught until the takeover of power by violence has been achieved.
South Africa's repressive policies even further alienated its principal allies in the West.
The peoples of the world are looking at our country, and they're saying, why, if we thought that democracy was right for America in 1776, why don't we think it's right for the peoples of South Africa? We can do no less than to stand up on the side of the blacks.
From my friends in the West, they continuously told me as Minister of Foreign Affairs that you are attracting communism. You are attracting communism almost like a dead animal attracting flies and vultures. You're smelling. You must get rid of the smell, apartheid.
The message got through to many establishment Afrikaners, the white South Africans of Dutch descent. Unaware of their government's approaches to Mandela, they felt a need for a dialogue with the ANC. One group of academics and businessmen met the enemy in the west of England.
The first person I noticed was someone whose face I immediately recognized, and he was from the South African Communist Party. And I'll tell you exactly how I felt. Shivers went down my Afrikaner spine.
So a second set of secret meetings between whites and blacks paralleled Mandela's prison negotiations with the government.
The kind of people that we had discussions with were the kind of people that cut across different levels of African society. In other words, they would be able to put across the views of the ANC to every other Afrikaner.
The ANC just told us, listen, we can't talk about the reform of apartheid. How can you reform a system like apartheid? And that was a crucial moment in the discussions, because then after some debate, we realized that what we need to talk about was how the system could be abolished.
While these meetings were being held in England, the government took another step.
Kobe could say during my negotiations with him said he would like me to leave Portsmouth to a place where I would be in a status between prison and freedom.
Mandela was transferred to a spacious house within the grounds of another prison.
It was really not a prison or a house. It was an office at which the leader of the ANC within the country was actually conducting business.
The purpose was, of course, that if you want to prepare a person for reintegration to society, is to give him opportunity to see what society is like and to experience it at first hand.
In public, President Botha still remained adamant that he would never talk to terrorists. Meanwhile, his secret committee was sending him reports about Mandela's repeated requests for a meeting with the president and their attempts to get him to renounce violence.
The only way in which I could renounce violence is that we should sit down and talk. And depending on the progress of the negotiations, then we would call off the armed struggle.
The discussions in Mandela's prison house led to a compromise. He would not renounce violence, but he did commit himself to seeking a peaceful solution. With that, Botha agreed to meet him, but fate intervened.
Some damage to some of his brain cells occurred. And naturally that would affect the man's efficiency and perhaps even his thinking.
P.W. Botha resigned as National Party leader but insisted on remaining president.
There was a general feeling, I think, amongst all members of the cabinet that this was a completely unsatisfactory situation with this split between the headship of the party and the headship of the state.
If you want to deal with the dastardly type of acts that we have to face,
the National Party elected as its new leader the supposed right-winger F.W. de Klerk.
It was also quite clear, without any doubt whatsoever, that P.W. Botha was displeased by the fact that F.W. de Klerk had been elected as the new party leader and not somebody else.
In the midst of this turmoil within the government, President Botha's long-awaited meeting with Mandela finally took place. For 30 years, Mandela had repeatedly requested meetings with South Africa's white leaders. Now, at last, he was smuggled out of his prison and into the president's office at Tynhuys.
When I actually entered Tynhuys, I was tense because I was expecting a fight. As I entered, he came from the other door with his hand outstretched, stretched out and smiling.
The meeting went smoothly, but the government tried to exploit it to drive a wedge between Mandela and the rest of the ANC.
We issued a joint statement in which we pledged ourselves to work for peace in our country.
Mandela and Botha had both committed themselves to peaceful development. This enabled the National Party to claim there was a rift between Mandela and the ANC. The government announced they could say yes to Mandela and no to the terrorist ANC.
the commitment of Mr. Mandela to peaceful development places the meeting in proper perspective. But it does more. It confronts the ANC with a definite choice. Is it prepared to follow the lead given by him and to commit itself to the pursuit of peaceful solutions?
The suspicion that was generated by the leaks that had occurred, that negotiations were taking place, reached a peak with the meeting which Mandela had with P.W. Botha.
Mr. P.W. Botha and Kubi Kutsie just happened to be the most senior of Mandela's captors.
People really became concerned and were wondering what was happening.
To pretend that Mr. Mandela is able to talk to them to any significant effect without having normal access to his people and his organization is nothing short of political mischief. In Mandela's own words, prisoners cannot enter into contracts. Only free men can negotiate.
President Botha had successfully sown discord within the ANC, but it was to be his last achievement. A general election was imminent, and the president's conduct was becoming increasingly erratic.
P.W. Botha's health was not good. He was a sick man.
The cabinet decided that we would then formally request Mr. Botha to step down.
Determined to cling on, President Botha summoned his rebellious ministers to a cabinet meeting in Cape Town.
I obviously, as leader of the party, led the discussion. I stated the basic case, why we believed that it would be impossible for him to stay on.
The majority indicated that they thought it was time for him to take a rest. He didn't like it.
It was now necessary for him to step down. In fact, it had been necessary already a couple of months earlier.
In the end, he got up and said goodbye to each of us. And just before he left, through that door in the cabinet, he said, but I warn you, this evening on television, I will go for you.
Dit is vir my duidelik dat ek na al die jare van my beste pogings geïgnoreer word deur ministers wat in my kabinet dien. Gevolglik het ek geen keuse nie as om my uittrede aan te kondig.
De Klerk became acting president and now learned details of the 3 years of secret negotiations with Mandela. His intelligence service set out to probe deeper into the ANC's position.
We had known for some time by then that a series of meetings had been going on in Britain between prominent South Africans and leaders of the ANC, normally under the leadership of Thabo Mbeki.
In the course of those discussions, Professor Esther said to me that there was a likelihood that the government might want to talk to us directly.
I sat in a London pub talking Mbeki and conveying to him the code word and then the message that the first meeting needs to take place.
When I reported to Oliver Tambo that this contact was now going to take place, he said to me that this is something that had worried him for many years. One of his nightmares was that one day there would come a message from the South African government saying, we want to negotiate, we want to settle, we want to end apartheid. And because we had not been in contact with them, we would not understand the message.
To South African voters, de Klerk's message was totally different. He proclaimed that only the National Party could stop the ANC.
The National Party say we don't deal with terrorism and we don't deal with perpetrators of violence. The ANC is committed to violence at this moment, is actually implementing a policy of violence, is continuously making itself guilty of acts of violence.
In spite of his words, right after the election, de Klerk gave the go-ahead. He authorized 2 secret agents to make a rendezvous with the ANC. So the third set of secret talks began.
We decided on Switzerland because we didn't need visas to enter Switzerland. It was the Palace Hotel in Lucerne, and we gave them the date. It was the 12th of September. They immediately agreed without making any adjustments, which we found surprising. They were followed for the whole distance that they traveled by our people. So when they arrived, we were quite sure they had no tails. They didn't even have any bodyguards with them, which was a surprising thing as far as we were concerned. We were extremely afraid that we were going to make some mistake to botch the whole thing.
They were afraid that even as we walked up the steps, if one of us sprained an ankle, we might say this was a trick of the Boers and so on, and so the whole thing would unravel.
In room 339 of the Palace Hotel, agents Mike Lowe and Maurits Sparvater waited to meet men whom their colleagues in the security services had been trying to assassinate.
As we could hear them coming down the corridor speaking to each other, I said to Maurits that we should open the door of our suite so that they could see for themselves that we were alone. There were no guns.
The room opened, the 2 gentlemen standing there
We stepped forward and introduced ourselves under our assumed names, and they introduced themselves under their genuine names.
I said something to the fact that, well, here come the terrorists and the communists. Indeed, in the process of the discussion, I remember Thabo talking to me in Zulu, explaining that sitting here with the enemy, I feel my stomach moving.
Once again, the Afrikaners asked questions about the government's obsession, the ANC's alliance with the Communist Party. It was clearly a sticking point.
What would South Africa be like if the ANC became government? What was the implication of certain ANC policy positions?
Despite concerns, the government continued to take tiny steps forward. Mandela was now given further glimpses of freedom. His warders took him on excursions to places he had mentioned.
One of the things that they mentioned was Paternoster, which is on the west coast. It's a very, very small little village, more of a fishing village.
I can remember the visit to Paternoster when we walked on the beach.
He said to me, he would like to walk on the sand, you know. I said, yes, but give me a few seconds. And I had warders and some of the policemen.
Mandela had not been seen in public or photographed for 25 years. He feared that a black man walking in front of white men would attract attention.
What used to happen is that you would have about 4 to 5 warders walking behind me, and I walking ahead. Now, that is not the position in South Africa. I said to Gregor and others, you must walk in front, and I should be behind, because that's what happens in South Africa. They said, no, you must walk in front, because they were now thinking in terms that I was plotting to escape. You must walk in front. I tried to persuade them that, look, you are actually exposing who I am. This is against security. No, you must walk in front. And they were just adamant.
On another beach, protest continued. President de Klerk's government faced their first test right after the election. A campaign to defy the laws of apartheid had built up in the preceding weeks. Police reaction was often brutal. On election day, police violence in the townships around Cape Town came to a head.
You got to hearing about police driving around in the townships and shooting at random and killing even youngsters who were not on the streets. I was under kind of prayer pressure to call a demonstration march to keep death off Cape Town's streets.
We received information that a march was planned from the St. George's Cathedral along Adderley Street to the parade.
The National Party had always regarded such demonstrations as a threat to law and order.
All actions of that nature at that time were illegal unless the participants received permission from the magistrate.
I got 2 calls, one from Mr. Flock, who was then Minister of Law and Order.
Normally in a crowd like this, there were wild ones, radicals, who were not so peaceful.
I said to him, well, why don't you let your police line the route, put their hands in their pockets and sort of whistle as we went past?
De Klerk's cabinet was divided over whether to permit this protest march or to crush it.
It was Mr. de Klerk's style to listen to all the arguments and then come out strongly with his decision.
A security analysis indicated that the mood was that should we suppress the demand to march that it would result in very, very strong reaction.
The newly elected president's decision to permit the demonstration seemed to signal a new era. A month later, de Klerk's government went further and released 4 leading ANC prisoners, including Walter Sisulu, who had been Mandela's closest colleague in jail. But de Klerk had not yet worked out how to take the final step. A remote game reserve in the northern Transvaal was the location for a government bosberaad, or bush conference. The entire cabinet gathered to discuss the crucial decision.
Mr. Mandela had to come out of jail sooner or later, either in a horizontal position or in a vertical position. And if he came out in a horizontal position, then he would have been a myth which one would never been able to destroy.
These were the words used by President de Klerk. It will be a dead-end street, and we can carry on fighting for 10, 15, or 20 years. But then this country would be a wasteland.
If you decide to release Mr. Mandela, you should not release him in 6 months' time. You should release him as soon as possible. But you could not release him unless you unbanned the ANC. You couldn't unban the ANC and leave their big allies, the Communist Party, behind bars.
Net na verdaging van een van die heel eerste sessies, het 'n groepie van ons staan gesels en het Kobie Coetzee na ons toe gekom en baie opgewonde met selfvertroue het hy gesê, "Fasten your seat belts, ladies and gentlemen, we are going places."
Change was in the air, but nobody knew quite what to expect. Meanwhile, international pressures continued to increase.
I was able to call the new president fairly easily on the telephone, and I would tell him I'm going overseas. And without fail, he would raise the question of, when are you going to ask for the lifting of sanctions?
In January 1990, a group of American congressmen visited South Africa. De Klerk hoped they would recommend that sanctions be relaxed.
Everything that we have seen leads us to the conclusion that unless the South African government acts decisively to meet the conditions required for negotiations with the anti-apartheid opposition, the international sanctions effort will have to be greatly strengthened and intensified.
De Klerk's state address to Parliament was due at the beginning of February. Everyone knew this was the moment he would have to state clearly his intentions. In his 4 months as president, de Klerk had allowed the ANC to raise its banners publicly, but it was still an illegal organization. The National Party still contended that the ANC was controlled by Moscow.
We said that we should keep the South African Communist Party still a banned party. The reason for this was, we said they are still a danger.
The decision to unban the Communist Party in conjunction with the ANC was the most difficult part of the whole unbanning decision.
The collapse of Soviet imperialism finally gave de Klerk the out he needed.
Many believing Christians in the government and elsewhere saw the events that took place internationally as a God-given or heavenly given opportunity.
The Berlin Wall fell down. In fact, the whole Soviet bloc fell down in the last quarter of 1989. And this created a very different situation in South Africa.
Our analysis was that with the breakdown of the force of communism and the power of communism worldwide, the South African Communist Party's influence within the ANC would wane.
Decision Day, February 2nd, 1990, dawned. De Klerk's family had been at the heart of Afrikaner nationalism for 3 generations. Would he risk everything that they and he had stood for?
I knew that South Africa would never be the same again. That on delivery of that speech, we would be changing the course of history in our country. And I stood in awe of the importance of the moment.
The steps that have been decided are the following. The prohibition of the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the South African Communist Party, and a number of subsidiary organizations is being rescinded. I wish to put it plainly that the government has taken a firm decision to release Mr. Mandela unconditionally. I am serious about bringing this matter to finality without delay.
A week later, de Klerk had Mandela brought from his jail and told him that he was to be released the following day.
What the government wanted to do was just to shove me secretly to my home so that people should have no opportunity of welcoming me.
Mr. Mandela said that he isn't ready yet. And he took up the position that he still had to see certain supporters.
He did phone to say we must give him time, we mustn't arrive before such and such an hour, which was very odd for a man who had been in prison for 27 years to say delay fetching me.
What I wanted to happen was that our people should be given notice that I'm coming out so as to prepare to welcome me. This was the point.
So I asked, but what does that mean? I mean, haven't you spent 27 years packing, which is what you kept telling me? And now that we have to come and fetch you, you say you're not ready. I can't believe this.
As the ANC celebrated in anticipation, de Klerk insisted that Mandela must leave prison the next day.
I must tell you, it was very, very hectic on the day of his release. People were phoning, and it was crazy. And the helicopters were hanging over the house. You could barely hear yourself speaking.
There suddenly was the word that Mr. Mandela is coming. We took off into the air, and we stayed at about, I would say, 1,000 meters up in the air. Mr. Mandela and Mrs. Mandela got out of the car, and they walked up.
I was quite frightened by the crowd. And the warders, and their families were just swamped by the crowd. Not only were they outside the gate, but they had pushed themselves inside. And there was a great deal of chaos and confusion.
Mandela's motorcade left for Cape Town City Hall, where he was to make his first speech in 27 years. As he surveyed an excited crowd, there was a small problem.
After Mr. Mandela left, I walked into the room, his bedroom, and I saw his glasses on the dressing table. So they left without taking his glasses. So whoever looks at that video again, he can see that he's got glasses which are sort of not fitting him properly, and he's holding his paper away.
We call on our people.
Mandela borrowed his wife's glasses. De Klerk's government waited to hear two things: a renunciation of violence and a call for an end to the armed struggle.
Which necessitated the armed struggle still exists today. We have no option but to continue.
The government also hoped for an appeal for the lifting of sanctions.
We call on the international community to continue the campaign to isolate the apartheid regime. I am a loyal and disciplined member of the African National Congress.
Following Nelson Mandela's release from prison on February 11, 1990, celebrations swept across South Africa and the world. After half a century of apartheid and repression, the country seemed to at last be heading for democracy. Mandela was now a loud and clear voice for a people long silenced.
When I came out, there was naturally a great surge of optimism on the part of our people. They could see that this was the beginning of a new era, that their hopes and dreams were about to be realized.
The hopes and dreams soon evaporated when South Africa erupted into the worst violence ever. For the first time, former cabinet members admit that a conspiracy within the government, a third force, was probably behind the bloodshed. By stirring up tribal rifts and secretly backing black groups who opposed Mandela and the African National Congress, this alleged third force fanned the flames of hatred and fear.
What all of this was designed to achieve was the perpetuation of white minority rule, to subvert the movement towards genuine change.
With Mandela free and the anti-apartheid organizations unbanned, the next step was negotiations between all parties as to how South Africa would be governed. To create a peaceful climate for talks, Mandela urged his supporters to give up their weapons.
My message is this: take your guns, your knives, and your pangas, and throw them into the sea.
But President F.W. de Klerk had unleashed powerful forces by unbanning the ANC. Would he now be able to control the process of change and retain the white hold on power? The historic first meeting between the ANC and the government ended on an upbeat note.
It has been this government's goal to normalize the political process. Today we can say that a great step forward has been taken.
Three months later, political violence which had long ravaged Natal province leapfrogged into the black townships around Johannesburg. For years, black men from outlying tribal reserves had come to Johannesburg to work. Members of Zulu and Xhosa groups stayed in migrant workers' hostels, like this one in Kakiso, a strongly ANC township.
There was a rumor flying around that the Xhosas are going to attack the Zulus, or the Zulus are going to attack the Xhosas. The Xhosas then decided to send their leaders to meet with the Zulu chiefs inside there. And immediately just there, they were confronted by a band of armed Zulu-speaking residents, and 14 people were massacred.
After the massacre, armed Zulus drove out all Xhosas and other blacks and took over the hostel. 2 weeks later, anti-ANC Zulus, distinguished by their red headbands, prepared for an attack on Kakiso's ANC supporters.
I saw a troop of about 3,500 or so thousand people. The Zulu impis, I'll call them that now, the troop, really in a fighting mood, armed to the teeth, crossing the street. Now the violence really started. Properties were stolen, houses attacked, innocent people were killed.
Kakiso's ANC supporters, wearing white headbands, prepared to fight back.
Obviously, then a fight ensued. The community begins to organize, defense structures to defend, to retaliate. The youth is very angry. Violence is now engulfing the whole township.
In 3 days of fierce fighting, 32 people were killed. The government blamed the new violence on what it called black-on-black tribal conflict. At the funeral of the Kakiso victims, a different explanation was offered.
We have information that this act against the people of South Africa was planned, and the police were informed about the plans, but they did nothing.
Even the National Party representative for this area had his doubts.
My sources in the residence had told me that the people who had participated in these acts of violence were not known residents of Kagiso, that the people from the outside that were bussed in could only have done so with the support of unknown entities. And they hinted that the state was involved in this.
The official explanation was the same old story, which was
that this was just, as we had referred to it in the past, simply a black-on-black violence. I had the suspicion that it was institutionalized. I had the suspicion that it was not as innocent as it was presented to the political leadership.
The violence followed a pattern. The Zulu attacks spread from one township to another, and ANC counterattacks turned it into a civil war that raged across the most densely populated part of South Africa. The bloodshed was dismissed by the government as tribal and self-inflicted.
If there is an attitude, if there is hate amongst the people of a country, they would go for each other. It is impossible to have a policeman or a soldier present in front of every door, on every street corner, to prevent people to kill each other.
As the death toll mounted, Mandela took it up with the president.
I went to Mr. de Klerk several times to urge him to take action. And I said that you have got the muscle, the forces to put an end to this violence. Why are you not using it to stop this massacre?
Mandela had described de Klerk as a man of integrity. Now he began to have second thoughts.
It became clear to me that I was dealing with an ordinary white man, in spite of everything that he had said. He was not moved by the massacre of so many people. He still regarded the black lives as flies, like flies.
Several miles from the Kakiso hostel was a large squatter camp called Swaneville.
It was about 4:30. I heard the sounds of guns, and I saw a big group of people, about maybe 800 or 1,000, and everything behind them was burning. I could see faces of the people that are coming. Others had some red bands on their heads, others had guns, others spears, and others were white amongst those.
The attack was again mounted by anti-ANC Zulus from the Kakiso hostel, but this time they seemed much more organized.
The police were amongst those people. Police vehicles loaded some of the goods that were looted from the shacks, and cartridges that we found there are also the police cartridges. They were helping attacking the innocent people that are defenseless.
"29 people died in the Swaneville attack. The local representative spoke out.
This sounds to me like a military operation, where was the operations room. Who was in charge of this? The answer was vague and uncertain, and I reported the matter to the Deputy Minister of Law and Order at the time.
After having received a full report, I wasn't satisfied with what happened.
I said to Johan Skeppers that you have to get to the bottom of this because something does not ring true. How it was possible for an MP of thousands of people to move from Kagiso hostels, launch an attack on Swaneville, kill a number of people without anybody noticing what was happening.
So what I did was to instruct the then Deputy Commissioner of Police to lodge a full investigation and to prosecute policemen if need be. I, however, was overruled subsequently by the Minister of Law and Order.
It was possible that the police were involved, but once again, it was probably individual members and not the police as a force. I mean, the senior officers, the officers in charge, they didn't know about the possible involvement of any policeman on the ground.
I would like to comment on the legitimacy of decisions taken by ministers. I, however, differed from the decision. I thought that the policeman should have been prosecuted or even suspended. And I reported the matter to the state president.
If I look back, I have no regrets on how this issue was managed, for the simple reason that the overwhelming majority of the South African police force are dedicated, law-enforcing officers.
Each time we mentioned it to Mr. de Klerk, and they had a knee-jerk reaction. We were seeking to discredit the police. They would say something like, maybe there are some bad police, but the force as a whole, I mean, is spotless.
The violence had two common features. One, most of those launching the attacks were supporters of the Zulu-based Inkatha Freedom Party. And two, the police either did nothing to stop them or actually helped them. The attacks prevented the ANC, which had been banned for 30 years, from getting organized. This gave the government and its ally, Inkatha, the advantage, as all parties prepared for negotiations on the country's future.
And who is supporting the red-banded thugs of Inkatha? Why are they being allowed to stab and to hack their way to the negotiating table? Have the police in the last 5 years broken up a single Inkatha demonstration?
In 1973, Inkatha's leader, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, had become chief minister of KwaZulu. This was the Zulu tribal state created as part of the South African government's policy of apartheid. Buthelezi was courted by the government because he opposed ANC policies of sanctions and armed struggle. He even claimed he was on an ANC hit list.
And it is a fact that I've been condemned to die by assassin by the African National Congress mission in exile.
Buthelezi's political future was threatened by Mandela's release and the unbanning of the ANC.
No power on earth, and most certainly nothing that the ANC can do, will shake Inkatha's resolve to claim its rightful place at the negotiating table.
A few weeks later, Inkatha fighters began their attacks on the pro-ANC townships. The attacks were so widespread and systematic that the third force conspiracy theory gained credence.
The third force, without doubt,
was a very significant part of the security forces, the police, the army.
Accusations were even leveled at President de Klerk.
It seemed to me to be part of a political strategy. I didn't know to what extent he himself was involved in the actual massacres in particular places. But it was clear to me that he was generally aware of the strategy, that it was the strategy, there was a third force whose task was to slaughter our people. I had no doubt whatsoever that he was well aware of this.
There were instances where the police did not act as they should have acted. It happens across the world. We've never said that we have a perfect police force, but the allegation of a third force suggests that within the police force there's a whole network of people, a whole conspiracy, applying a specific strategy to frustrate the policy of the government, to protect certain interests, and to persecute others.
I then became quite convinced that Mr. de Klerk either was incapable of controlling certain elements in the security forces, or those elements were doing what he wanted.
As far as third force activities are concerned, let me state categorically that I never received evidence of third force activities, and I was never involved or had knowledge of any third force activities whilst I was the Minister of Law and Order.
On the evidence I had, there was only one conclusion to come to, and that was that there was something operating that couldn't be identified at that stage.
Bit by bit, the truth began to emerge. In July 1991, a Johannesburg newspaper published secret memoranda revealing that the security branch of the South African police had funded Inkatha rallies.
The reason for the funding of Inkatha was that Inkatha was an organization against sanctions, and they had that marches where they carry the banners against sanctions against the country. And by funding them, we could show to the world that there were people against sanctions in this country, black people against sanctions.
In the light of these revelations, there is no difference whatsoever between the government and the Inkatha leadership. They are on the same payroll. It's going to be very difficult for us to continue to negotiate with the government, which is not negotiating in good faith.
A few months later came more serious revelations. In 1986, in a remote military preserve, 200 Inkatha activists had been given secret training by the South African Defense Force. A former Central Committee member of Inkatha claimed this was part of a much wider strategy.
The violence is instigated by the South African government, and it uses Inkatha as the actual perpetrators of this violence on the ground. In other words, the government has shifted strategy. Instead of the government itself actually perpetrating the violence, it has its own surrogates that are used for this purpose and to this end.
Although de Klerk admitted the military training of Inkatha, he claimed that its purpose had been merely to provide protection for the tribal state's VIPs. Under pressure from the ANC, President de Klerk appointed a judicial commission to investigate allegations of violence. The commission delivered its verdict on the training.
The training in 1986 was paid for by the South African Defence Force from secret funds. There was VIP protection, offensive training and defensive training. The offensive training included training in the use of firearms, explosives, including AK-47s, how to pull them apart and put them together, matters which clearly had nothing at all to do with VIP protection.
The Judicial Commission also found that the Inkatha members who had received this secret military training were then placed in the police force of the tribal state of KwaZulu, of which Buthelezi was not only chief minister, but police minister as well.
It was well known that only people loyal to the Inkatha party were employed as policemen. There was a widely held perception, and in my view a justified perception, that the KwaZulu police was in fact a private police force of the Inkatha Freedom Party.
The military trainees then formed squads that carried out brutal attacks on ANC-supporting communities across the country.
What has emerged is a high number of former trainees who have been involved and implicated in very serious hit squad activities and illegal activities as KwaZulu policemen.
3 members of the KwaZulu police were subsequently arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. They claimed they were operating under instructions from senior officials of the Inkatha Freedom Party, the IFP, and the KwaZulu Police, the KZP, and that they received their orders from the party's headquarters at Ulundi.
We would be called to Ulundi. We'll meet with the officials, KZP and IP officials, then names of the people to be eliminated to be given to us.
I was trained by the military intelligence of South Africa, who was by then in good terms with Inkatha.
Then we'll be given equipment, firearms, explosive, everything. Then we'll go out and we'll conduct that, we'll carry out those orders, things like that.
Although I'm not in a position to reveal out any names, but it's a fact that I acted on instructions.
Each and every region has got his members.
The purpose was just to be able to act against the activities of our enemies.
If ever there was an operation that was supposed to be done outside KwaZulu, then the whole members of the hit squad will be called up to Lundi. Those who are regarded as cream of the hit squad will go and carry out instruction in a certain province.
All 3 were tried at this court in November 1994 and found guilty of a series of crimes, including murder. A further report from the Goldstone Commission revealed yet another network of government criminal activity. Much of the township violence was found to have been masterminded by a secretly funded unit of the South African police. It was based here on the outskirts of Pretoria, the country's capital, on a farm called Vlakplaas.
It emerged from our inquiry into the activities of people at Vlakplaas that they were involved in gun running to Inkatha, in the assassination of a number of people who were considered politically undesirable.
In 1994, the head of the Vlakplaas police unit, Colonel Eugene de Kock, was arrested. He is now standing trial on 101 counts of murder, kidnapping, fraud, and gun running.
The evidence that we were given by some of the police officers involved in those activities indicated, according to them, that 3 senior members of the South African police, Generals Marcy Smith, Johan Leroux, and Krapis Engelbrecht, were aware of those activities and didn't stop them.
Following these allegations, the 3 generals, Smith, the Deputy Commissioner of Police, Leroux, the head of investigation, and Engelbrecht, the head of crime intelligence, were all suspended. The unit at Vlakplaas was also found to have operated a weapons factory, to have distributed guns to Inkatha, and even to have instigated random killings on commuter trains.
The evidence we got in relation to the Vlakplaas investigation indicated that large quantities of guns, AK-47s, were being supplied to the Inkatha Freedom Party by members of the South African police, and for some of those arms, including homemade weapons, that were being put into the hostels and which were being used to fan the violence.
The effect of the violence was to weaken and divide the ANC.
through the violence, the ANC was not able at the time to mobilize effectively throughout the country. People were becoming disillusioned.
It made it difficult for the ANC to reach consensus within its own ranks. Because then people were saying, why must we negotiate when this government that we want to negotiate with is killing us, is killing our people, killing our children?
The ANC's leaders became convinced this disarray was precisely what de Klerk wanted.
The reason why you are not using your capacity to put an end to violence is because you want to maintain the status quo. You wanted to either weaken or destroy the African National Congress. I said that to him openly.
As 19 parties met for the first session of a national convention to map out the future of a new South Africa, the government was feeling cocky. In his opening speech, de Klerk launched a public attack on Mandela, accusing him of allowing ANC guerrillas to keep their weapons.
An organization which remains committed to an armed struggle cannot be fully trusted, cannot be trusted completely when it also commits itself to peacefully negotiated solutions.
Angered by this unexpected attack, Mandela demanded time to reply.
He has launched an attack on the African National Congress. And in doing so, he has been less than frank. Even the head of an illegitimate, discredited minority regime has certain moral standards to uphold.
From this bad start, the talks lurched towards deadlock. The core issue of whether there should be straight majority rule or an enforced sharing of power between white and black loomed insurmountably between the two key players.
The ANC has now defined majority rule as the party that gets the majority support. The government is trying to paint that as blatantly racist black rule.
If 51% of the votes go to a party, why should that party claim 100% of the power?
But that's the way majority rule takes place in Britain or any of the democracies. Party that wins the majority votes forms the government of the day.
De Klerk wanted all future governments to be compulsory coalitions. This would enable the white minority to veto radical change.
The government strategy at that time, as it was from the very beginning, and remained to the end, was to save as much as could be saved of the accumulated privilege of the white constituency.
After 4 months, the inevitable crisis came over the votes needed to agree on clauses in the new constitution. The government insisted on 25% being enough to block agreement. The National Party believed it could secure the blocking 25% in the first democratic election with the help of its chief ally, Inkatha.
The relationship between Mr. de Klerk and Chief Buthelezi was a cozy relationship in the sense that they had set aside time to meet on an ongoing basis.
They were so close to the National Party's principles that you might well have asked, but shouldn't they be one party?
When the government refused to budge from its demand for a 25% blocking mechanism, the ANC saw this as a deadly threat to its goal of majority rule.
Cyril very deliberately put a proposal on the table which he knew they had to reject. And they would have to reject it out of hand.
We were involved in a situation where we had to break the National Party strategy in negotiations. So yes, we tabled the issue knowing that they would not accept it.
The ANC made their wrecking proposal. The National Party, as planned, rejected it.
I once again asked, and others supported me, let us not wreck the negotiations at this stage. The reply was by Cyril, we will not go back to our party. This is it.
A month later, the violence resumed when armed Zulus carried out a night raid on a township called Boipatong, killing 48 residents, including a baby. It was the worst of the massacres, and anti-government feelings soared. Mandela responded by announcing the end of all talks with the government.
I can no longer explain to our people why we continue to talk to a government, to a regime which is murdering our people.
It became clear to the leadership of the movement as a whole that we needed to put the entire struggle against apartheid on a completely different plane. And that plane had to be resorting back to the major power that we had, which was our people.
Anger swept through the black community. The ANC responded to the surging militancy by launching a campaign of widespread protest or rolling mass action. For 2 months, rallies, sit-ins, and work stoppages mobilized hundreds of thousands of people all across the country.
We saw various and manifold acts of defiance, strikes, occupations of government offices, sit-ins in the streets, preventing the traffic from flowing.
I want to inform you that you're gathering illegally on the premises of the hospital.
A prolonged strike disrupted the health service. Access to hospitals was blocked, township clinics were firebombed, and water systems vandalized.
Services were simply stopped by strike actions, as well as intimidation actions to prevent nurses from going to work. The sanitation systems were demolished, the water systems were demolished. It was an action to destabilize community life as well as government, good government.
The huge demonstrations showed the government the extent of the ANC's mass support. A general strike and a week of nationwide protests brought South Africa to a standstill. The week culminated in a march on the government's headquarters in Pretoria.
The whole concept of rolling mass action caught fire throughout the country, and our structures were energized. They were all pushing for one goal, and that was, if need be, to bring the apartheid regime down.
Next, the ANC turned its sights on a hated feature of the apartheid system, the tribal states. A march was organized in the capital city of Ciskei, which, like other tribal homelands, had been granted semi-autonomy a decade earlier. The Ciskei government would cease to exist should apartheid be abolished, so it greatly feared the ANC's growing power. Ciskei refused to allow ANC political activities within its borders. As demonstrators moved toward the city center, they were met by lines of Ciskei troops. No one expected the soldiers to shoot.
Many of us were terrified. I have never been as terrified as I was I thought I was actually quite close to death.
The Ciskei massacre, televised worldwide, claimed 28 lives and severely embarrassed the de Klerk government. It was the climax to 4 months of trauma.
1992 was the year of the earthquakes in this country, and to many foreign commentators and observers, we were heading for disaster.
The economy was going down, no confidence in the country, uncertainty in the minds of whites and blacks about the future.
The whole world, quite frankly, thought this was it. This was the doom prophets had predicted by then that, look, this thing in South Africa would not work. The divisions were too deep, the historic anger too profound.
So we were moving more and more to the precipice.
But the government was past the point of no return. It could not reban the ANC, and it could not put Mandela back in prison.
So FW said in a cabinet meeting, this cannot continue any longer. We must get the ANC back to the negotiating table. We must talk to them.
To ease tensions, de Klerk had replaced the hardline Delport with a younger, more flexible chief negotiator, Ruth Meyer, who was on good terms with Cyril Ramaphosa. They began a series of secret meetings.
The fact that Cyril Ramaphosa and myself knew each other, and that we by then already had a sort of a working relationship, helped us to keep contact.
He saw the necessity of keeping the talks on course. And he also realized that the policies that the National Party stood for were unworkable and they would never be accepted by the ANC and indeed by the general public.
The Meyer-Ramaphosa talks laid the groundwork for a summit meeting between de Klerk and Mandela to get the constitutional negotiations going again. Confident that the ANC now held the initiative, Mandela insisted that the summit must meet 3 outstanding demands.
These 3 constitute the core of the demands we have submitted to the government. Unless they are met satisfactorily by the government, negotiations cannot and will not resume.
The demands were hard for de Klerk to swallow. The first was for the release of all remaining ANC prisoners, including some who had been convicted of terrorist attacks in the 1980s.
It was very easy at the initial phases to release, for instance, those that were only in prison for the fact that they were members of certain organizations. But as the categories moved, let's say, upwards to those also responsible for certain criminal acts, it became more difficult and problematic to resolve.
There was really an outcry from our own supporters, liberal-minded people, the Democratic Party, some of our media, responsible media in this country, and even here and there a judge, that we were now releasing criminals, that this was going too far.
The day before de Klerk and Mandela were scheduled to meet, the ANC negotiators assembled at their Johannesburg headquarters.
Comrade Mandela and FW were on the phone at least 4 to 5 times that afternoon. President de Klerk came around with all sorts of technical arguments why it couldn't be done. He needed to see the Minister of Justice, and even then it would have to conform to the law. What about the definition of political prisoner, etc.?
But our president was as tough as nails. He was incredibly stubborn and really hard on the issue of the release of the political prisoners.
As de Klerk kept coming back with no's, I became nervous.
we started having jelly knees, fearing that everything is just going to fall apart and negotiations would never resume again.
My colleagues now were doubtful. They felt that my stand would sabotage the summit, which was very important. But I was confident.
He knew that they had reached a point where we could break them.
De Klerk wanted us more than we wanted him. And he desperately needed that summit. And I was not prepared to have him to get to that summit without paying a price for it.
The other two ANC demands were that Inkatha members be banned from carrying their so-called traditional weapons, and that razor wire fencing be put around their hostels.
The question of hostels was a very delicate one, a very emotional one, because Inkatha saw that as an assault on their position, because most of the hostels were inhabited by Inkatha supporters or Zulus.
What it meant was that the hostels were going to be converted openly like Nazi camps, like concentration camps.
The summit took place without Buthelezi. It was the government and the ANC that had to reach agreement before the constitutional talks could resume.
Important day. Oh, very important indeed. It's actually crucial.
De Klerk was in a jam. He needed the ANC, but if he gave in to Nelson Mandela's demands, he risked losing the support of Inkatha.
De Klerk kept on saying that he hadn't consulted his other ministers, and he hadn't fully read the document and needed time to do so. And our president insisted that he must study it there and then and append his signature jointly with him.
He was so calm. He just said, well, Mr. de Klerk, Mr. President, if that's the position, it's fine. But when we end this meeting and go to have the press conference, I shall have to say to the public that this meeting has been a total failure.
At no stage did I do anything because of a threat of a walkout. My commitment was to make that negotiation succeed through a process of give and take.
I think de Klerk knew that they were very vulnerable on this matter, and if they did not sign the record of understanding, everything would fall apart.
De Klerk yielded on all 3 points. Over the next few weeks, 300 prisoners were released. He agreed to fence key Inkatha hostels and to ban their traditional weapons. It was a watershed moment. The deal produced a reversal of political partnerships.
That, without any shadow of doubt, was the turning point of the whole negotiation process.
From that moment on, the two parties involved in managing the process were the National Party and the ANC.
As the ANC and the government agreed to return to the negotiating table, Buthelezi protested that he had been betrayed and broke off relations with de Klerk.
Nowhere can a government in a country pick on one party and go into the bush and make a pact, a record of understanding, to the exclusion of other parties.
That was the beginning then, of a wide gulf or separation that occurred between us and Inkatha, with their leadership attacking Mr. de Klerk and attacking the National Party and saying we were in cahoots with the ANC. We had secret agendas together, making plots together to grab power and exclude the rest of South Africa.
A furious Buthelezi formed new alliances with other tribal state leaders who felt the government had abandoned them, and with white extremists who wanted to form a breakaway state. All had armed forces of their own. Now, a new danger loomed on South Africa's road to democracy.
Een ding moet die wêreld daar buitekant weet. Ons kan nie sonder vryheid lewe en as dit dan moet, dan sal ons hom vat met die geweld van het werk.
Eugene Terre-Blanche, leader of the Afrikaner white supremacist movement known as the AWB. In the year before the 1994 election of Nelson Mandela, the AWB aggressively defended the apartheid system. Yet Terre-Blanche eventually helped destroy the very system he wanted to uphold. Terre-Blanche drew his strength from fears among white Afrikaners that their government was selling out to the African National Congress. In late 1992, the ruling National Party and the ANC were trying to break a deadlock that had stalled negotiations for 2 years. The ANC demanded straightforward majority rule. The National Party wanted some form of veto power. While the white extremists boycotted the negotiations, the two major players got together for informal talks.
We started having what we call boss beras, that is, talks away in the bush, between the ANC and the government, to try and thresh out outstanding issues.
It was probably for many of our ANC counterparts the first time that they flew in government aeroplanes. It was also significant because it was the first time that we flew together in any aeroplane whatsoever.
The negotiators went to a remote game lodge. One of the ANC negotiators was Joe Slovo, chairman of the Communist Party. The party had been allied with the ANC for decades. Slovo was also a top ANC executive. He had supported Soviet military action over the years. As chief of staff of the ANC's armed wing, he had sent guerrillas into action and made fiery funeral speeches.
To crush, once and for all, those who are responsible for so much mourning.
Slovo's reputation still sent shivers down the spines of government members at the conference.
I went to the swimming pool and found a stranger in the swimming pool, and I wanted to walk away from it when I discovered that this was Joe Slovo. Slovo noticed me, and I had no option but to join him. Now that I felt extremely uncomfortable about, because Joe Slovo, the communist, the terrorist, what would my late father have said about this? A staunch policeman, terrorist hunter, his son in the swimming pool with this communist terrorist.
But Slovo, now ill with cancer, had surprised everyone by revealing himself to be a pragmatist. He had proposed a reasonable compromise to break the deadlock. A sunset clause to create a period of power sharing which would then disappear like the setting sun. The National Party showed interest.
We realized that in the final instance, the major breakthrough that we have to make in this country was to find a settlement with the ANC. That's the reality.
We used to go in for a degree of jollification in the evenings, spend a bit of time in the pub together at night, And obviously, when you are negotiating with people and you create that kind of social rapport, things become easier and you get to know them, you get to understand each individual a little better.
The conference was a success, moving the country a little bit closer to a free and fair election.
It was the beginning of the process that eventually led us to an agreement and to a new constitution.
So Joe Slovo has been very instrumental in advocating a system where we could remove the fears of the minorities in the country and also moderate the arrogance of a majority, of a black majority.
Formal negotiations began soon after at the World Trade Center in Johannesburg. The ANC and the government agreed that their power-sharing coalition would last for 5 years. Other parties had to accept the terms.
There were, at the multi-party talks, 26 parties altogether. But every level-headed South African knew that essentially the settlement would come through what the government and the ANC could agree upon or not. The one had the power and the other one had the majority support.
The understanding between the ANC and the National Party angered Afrikaners of the right wing, dominated by the Conservative Party.
You can see this process of ANC National Party cooperating against the rest. For example, if there's some problems or suddenly there's a veto or something that's just got stuck, then firstly Slovo will pick it up. And you can see he sort of write a small note to Ramaphosa. Ramaphosa would then wink for Rolf Meyer, and the two of them would go outside. They would formulate some sort of proposal, come back, the one would propose, the other one would second it, and it was just being forced through.
We maintained a very close link with our principals. And I think we followed very much the same pattern in that regard. I reported to FW, and he reported to Mandela. But very much on the same basis. Very close line, very hands-on.
The partnership became known as the Rolf and Cyril Show. Right-wing Afrikaners saw it as a threat.
We were sure that one or another time the government will capitulate and hand over the country to the communist forces.
Not liking what they saw, the AWB demanded their own state.
My people, the Afrikaner folk, really has a right, according to international law, to demand some part of this land as their own. You have a place where a Brit can be British. I must have land where the Afrikaner, the Boer, can be a Boer.
A more moderate advocate of Afrikaner separatism was Constant Viljoen, former chief of the South African Defence Force and a war hero. In June 1993, Viljoen took a petition from an alliance of 20 right-wing groups called the Afrikaner Volksfront to the multi-party conference.
We were going to hand over at the World Trade Center some demands by the Volksfront. In other words, to have self-determination for the Afrikaner people. That was the intention.
Terre Blanche's AWB was there in force.
Eventually we got news that some of the people entering rather late were harassed at the gate. Some people were pulled out of their cars. It was getting a bit more ugly.
Then when the gates went open, the people started moving in, and then people started running.
Terre Blanche was leading the AWB contingent.
And we tried to stop the crowd in front of the building. I actually ran ahead myself because I realized what was taking place and I was going to stop them, and I did so. I got on top of a pole and I sort of signaled to all the people, and they did stop. And the whole crowd would have stopped in a very orderly manner. And then some AWB members on a vehicle came through. They ignored the warnings to stop.
They look like they're invading the place. Oh, look at it!
all of a sudden I saw the security people running out, and I said, "What's up?" And they said, they've broken through and they're coming. And then my own security man simply grabbed hold of me and ran.
Pandemonium just broke out in the entire building. Many people on the ANC side, from the government side, all huddled into the government offices. We thought the right-wingers would never dare just march into government offices and start accosting people or assaulting them. And in fact, we even feared that we would be shot at.
The AWB overwhelmed the police.
Signs of glass and everything shattering and everything, and reports coming through that they are looking for us, particularly Rolf and Cyril.
Terrified delegates barricaded themselves in their offices. In the conference chamber, the AWB chanted and wrote graffiti demanding a separate white state.
An important turning point in this process was when my security guards kneeled down with their automatic weapons pointed at the corridor, and as the AWB people came around the corridor, shouted to them, "Stop!"
Ministers were compelled to promise Terre Blanche there would be no arrests. He agreed to take his men out.
Now, this had caused not only a collapse of what we had intended, but what was intended to be something for the attention of the world, then was turned against us.
I was able to discuss the events with some of the National Party ministers, and they, in the end, I think, drove them more and more away from having any form of understanding or even sympathy with the right-wingers.
Soon after the invasion, negotiators agreed that an election should be held the following April.
I have Mr. Mayor's support.
With the ANC growing in confidence and looking certain to win the election, the National Party had retreated bit by bit on nearly all its power-sharing demands. One remained. The National Party insisted that its white minority ministers must have the power to block ANC decisions within the cabinet. They called this governing by consensus.
It was the one issue on which the ANC was not prepared to make a concession on. That is, the cabinet should be able to take decisions by majority rather than by consensus as they had originally wanted it.
When the last day of the conference came, Ramaphosa was convinced the government's negotiators, headed by Rolf Meyer, could not afford to take the blame for a breakdown.
We therefore realized that this was their weak point and pressed on very hard until we finally got them to agree in the very early hours of the morning to that cabinet should be able to take decisions by majority rather than on a consensus basis.
This meant that if the ANC won the election, it would run the government.
It was indicated that no voting, in fact, would take place, which would mean that our representatives in cabinet would be in a position to influence, to persuade, but would have no final say or veto of any kind. And I disagreed with that.
Delport raised the issue with President de Klerk.
It was a very emotional moment for me. I think it was also an emotional moment for State President de Klerk. I voiced the concern that we maybe eventually end up as National Party being co-opted into an ANC government.
I took the decision and gave the lead that what we should go for is what is now in the Constitution, namely that there will be no voting.
Die basiese beginsels van magsdeling dat minderheidsgroepe werklike inspraak sou hê om besluitneming te beïnvloed. Dit het nie werklik gematerialiseer nie. Die verste wat ons kan gaan, is om te sê dat ons het 'n teenwoordigheid onderhandel in die kabinet en ons kan waarskynlik by force of presence kan ons besluite probeer beïnvloed.
As the conference wound up with the ANC triumphant, Ramaphosa celebrated his 41st birthday.
I was able to see Ruth Meyer for the first time dancing on the floor where we were having this party. He was quite happy, he was quite jovial, and I kept wondering whether I would have been as happy as he was if I was in his position, having finally given in the way that they had.
Key National Party negotiators were satisfied they had struck a workable deal with an adversary they had grown to trust. Now the election could proceed. Terre Blanche threw all his weight into stopping the election. He held a rally at the Pretoria Monument to the Afrikaner pioneers. He said if Mandela wanted war, he would get war. Terre Blanche then persuaded the Volksfront to boycott and oppose the election.
Ons het nie nodig om te verduidelik dat ons wit is. God het ons so gemaak en trouw as sy kinders staan ons daarby. Ons agter die voorsitter het nie nodig om grond te vra. Ons het grond, ons is die beskawers van Suid-Afrika. Ons is nie bereid om in 'n verkiesing in te gaan waar die ANC die boere se koppe tel.
Terre Blanche threatened force to block the election. Right-wingers looked to Viljoen, the experienced general, for leadership. He was reluctant, though he said he could call on 14,000 army reservists.
I also had forces available, I would say, from what would split off from the defense force. Because had I really taken a military action, there was a real danger of polarization within the defense force. It would certainly have been a substantial number of people that would have splitted from the defense force and would have joined me in fighting for the liberation of the Afrikaner people.
The Volksfront needed allies. Under apartheid, each of South Africa's black groups was assigned to a semi-autonomous tribal state. These tribal states were to be abolished on election day. Of the 10 tribal states around the country's periphery, the most populous was KwaZulu in the province of Natal. KwaZulu was a one-party state run by the IFP, the Inkatha Freedom Party of Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi. He was refusing to take part in the election, and he could take an additional 3 million Zulu votes with him.
To organize elections with such a large sector of the potential electorate being non-starters seriously assails the credibility of the exercise.
The ANC now had members on a transitional council which monitored the cabinet on matters concerning the election. They also had access to the intelligence services that had once spied on them, so they could now see what their adversaries were up to.
Chief Buthelezi was a greater threat to the process in Terre Blanche because Chief Buthelezi did have a base. He had an ethnic base, a base which had as its main content political backwardness among some of his constituents, but he did have a base and he was able to do damage.
Inkatha's objectives were a war of resistance to the elections, possibly leading to secession, even though it was a harebrained idea, and certainly based on training from the ultra-white right. One IFP member confirmed that he'd seen the bill for the training of IFP members in Northern Transvaal by the white right.
Here in the Rand and in Transvaal, there were certain camps where some of the Zulus were trained by AWB instructors.
Another tribal state was part of the alliance with the white right. Botswana, or BOP, was largely rural and poor, yet it would be the main threat to the transition to democracy. BOP was scattered over 7 areas. Its showpiece was the capital, Mbato. The tribal state had been recognized by South Africa as an independent country, though the rest of the world and the ANC refused such recognition. Its president was Lucas Mangope. About a third of its budget was provided by South Africa. Its army of 5,000 men was led partly by officers from the South African forces. Under the constitution that had just been agreed, Botswana would once again be absorbed by South Africa. Mangope did not like this prospect, and so he had outlawed electoral activity in BOP.
President de Klerk came here, for instance, about 2, 3, 4 times, together with Mr. Beckboerter, to try and influence our president here to give in.
We said to him he could not prevent South Africans, and a vast number of the people living in his country are South African citizens, that they had a right to participate freely in democratic activities, meetings, and in the election.
Mangope denied that right. He formed a pact with General Viljoen, Chief Buthelezi, and the leader of another tribal state. This alliance of BOP with right-wing Afrikaners posed a serious threat to the whole transition to democracy.
The white right would have territory of BOP, access to BOP arsenals, and would have black cannon fodder through Umkata.
BOP's 8,000 police dealt firmly with political and other protest. They would not allow the ANC to campaign there. ANC agents warned BOP's civil servants that Mangope's government would disappear on election day, leaving no one to pay their salaries and pensions. The BOP civil servants demanded their money immediately. Demonstrations became riots. General Jack Turner was an advisor to President Mangope.
Even the security forces were being terrorized. Their houses were being burned down. Their families were being terrorized. They didn't know exactly if they go home that evening, is their house still going to be intact?
But Mangope stood firm. When some of his black soldiers urged him to abandon his independence, he refused.
He warned the defense force. He said to them on that day, "Look, gentlemen, if you feel you cannot toe the line with me, give me that which is mine and leave the defense force. I'll go and get some other people to come and be in this defense force."
The other people Mangope counted on were Viljoen's militia of army reservists, who were members of the right-wing Volksfront alliance. As students rioted and his capital went out of control, Mangope called on Viljoen's militia of Afrikaner farmers.
He then requested from me assistance for that weekend. I then said to Mr. Mangope that I am prepared to move in farmers for this purpose. Mr. Mangope then said to me, "Please, as far as the farmers are concerned, I will be very happy to have them, because I believe that we have a close relationship. But please do not bring the AWB."
I emphasized to them, "Please, come in. Do not bring in the AWB."
Terre Blanche's men were regarded as rabid racists, but now Terre Blanche announced that he would help Mangope, so the whole white right was going in.
At least some of the elements of the white right wing saw in this an opportunity to establish, perhaps an Afrikaner alliance with a president like Mangope, and maybe later make a deal with him for a homeland of their own or a Volksstaat of their own.
The day after Terre Blanche announced his readiness to help, part of the BOP police force mutinied and joined the demonstrators. Law enforcement ceased. Looting ensued at Mbato's main shopping center. soldiers of the BOP Defense Force were nowhere to be seen. Terre Blanche seized the moment. He issued an appeal over Radio Pretoria, a pirate station of the White Right, for AWB members to gather with full kit. Viljoen and other more moderate leaders now tried to stop Terre Blanche.
He said, I have had an agreement with the state president, and I phoned him already, and I said I will take in my men tonight, so I'm going to take in my men. So I did.
I had a call from Mr. Eugene Terre Blanche, who offered to come in and help. And I said, please don't come in.
But the AWB went in anyway. Although worried about the AWB, Viljoen was determined to keep Mangope in power and the right-wing alliance intact. So he summoned his militia of 3,000 to 4,000 unarmed farmers. Viljoen gave the job of mobilizing the force to save Mangope to a former South African Army brigadier, Do Steyn.
Die mense wat ingegaan het nie militêre wapens saamgeneem nie vir eenvoudige rede dat dit sou misbruik wees van 'n militêre wapen. Militêre wapens soos uitgereik in die RSA word aangewend in opdrag van die weermag. Hierdie was nie 'n opdrag van die weermag nie. Hierdie was 'n volksfront operasie. Vir daai rede is daar ooreengekom deur generaal Viljoen met generaal Tenner van die Botswana, die weermag, dat die BOP weermag sou vir ons die wapens beskikbaar gestel het wat ons nodig gehad het vir die operasie.
In Pretoria, intelligence reports suggested that if Viljoen's men held BOP, the SADF, the South African Defence Force, might refuse to fire on them.
There were also reports that the White Right, and particularly Constant Viljoen's group, had access to the commandos in the SADF, that the loyalty of the police went to the right wing also, and therefore, extending beyond that scenario, there was a prospect that the de Klerk government could be toppled by the military.
Steyn took his men to BOP's military air base. They were to sleep in the hangars there and get the weapons they needed. The next day, armed, they were to restore order and keep BOP's independence intact. The intruder Terre Blanche had also been allowed into the air base. This was to keep him out of town, where AWB men had already been terrorizing local blacks. Turner sent officers to fetch both Terre Blanche and Volksfront militia leader Steyn.
So I said, yes, I will go in and I'll follow them, and they took me to Jack Turner.
Turner saw the welcome Volksfront man and the unwelcome AWB man together at Defense Headquarters.
I asked Mr. Terre Blanche, what were they doing there? And he said, they have come to help. So I said, but we did not ask for your help. And he said, your president asked for help.
Turner consulted his superiors.
And then he demands that I must leave Botswana. Me, Terre Blanche, must leave Botswana. Because I'm busy overheating the situation because of my presence. So I said to him, that's bloody nonsense.
More looting and disorder was expected at dawn, but the argument with Terre Blanche went on all night.
Ek was baie frustreerd, want die tyd het geloop. Hierdie ouens wil hê ek moet môreoggend as die son opkom moet ek in operasie wees, maar die wapens word nie uitgereik nie.
Well, I said, gentlemen, it can't carry on like this, and we want the AWB out of Mabatu as soon as possible. And I wanted them out before first light, before the people started seeing that the AWB were there. And why I knew there was going to be conflict, because the AWB was seen to be a racist type of organization. And our soldiers were, especially our soldiers, were against them being there.
By now, the BOP army had noticed Terre Blanche's presence at their headquarters.
When my own troops heard that some of the weapons were being earmarked for the Volksfront, they didn't like it very much. In actual fact, they refused to load any weapons onto vehicles, and that any of the weapons were to be given to the Volksfront. Because once again, they saw the Volksfront as part of the AWB contingent.
One BOP soldier explained the army's position.
Het het gesê, daar word nie meer in die BOP weermag onderskeid gemaak tussen Volksfront en AWB nie. Elke ou wat nou daar rondloop wat nie deel van die BOP weermag is nie, word beskou as 'n lid van die AWB.
When dawn revealed the white right at the air base, the BOP soldiers' anger grew.
They wanted us to get rid of them as soon as possible. And they even said that they were preparing to attack those people if those people did not leave immediately.
Eventually, the AWB agreed to leave. What happened then helped bring down the regime they had tried to save, and with it, the whole breakaway movement. As they drove out, the AWB men were in a foul mood. They fired indiscriminately at people on street corners, killing and wounding many.
When I'm on the way to go and fetch my text, Marota, the AWB just shoot us.
I just hear the shooting, and I get inside the car. I was just crying. I told the people, they shoot me in the leg for nothing.
This casual butchery further enraged the BOP army. The AWB was now driving out of town in several columns. Not all of them found their road clear. In one area, a crowd formed at a roadblock manned by BOP soldiers. The crowd chanted anti-AWB slogans. One of the departing AWB columns headed towards them and opened fire to clear the road. The crowd scattered. Then, as the convoy drove past, an AWB man in the front seat of a blue Mercedes near the back of the convoy leaned from the window and took aim. BOP soldiers opened fire. In the distance, the blue Mercedes is the target for the soldiers' pent-up anger. It is riddled with bullets. With the driver fatally wounded, 2 other injured men clambered out.
Press people, please. People, can you just get us some help for him, please? He's just wounded. Are you finished with your photos and stuff? Please get the ambulance now. We need the ambulance for this guy that's wounded. Huh?
So are you a member of the AWB? Yeah. You're a member of the AWB? Yeah.
And there they murdered them. They just murdered them, what you saw on television.
Please get me out, please. I'm bleeding. I'm already laying here for 15 minutes, up to 20 minutes. Can you please
No, they've called an ambulance is coming.
What were you doing here, sir?
Suddenly, one of the BOP policemen pumped bullets into the wounded AWB men.
3 of them were shot like dogs in the glaring publicity of television lights and cameras. That had an enormous effect on the right-wing willingness to resist the elections further by means of violence and terrorism.
And I think mothers, wives, parents for the first time realized that this talk of fighting it for a Boer start meant that their sons and daughters would be killed no matter how tough they talked.
The events were sad, but it did have the effect that you cannot play with the peace process in this country, and this country is simply not up for grabs.
Now you held me responsible. At least the AWB tried to help, and what is more interesting is, at least on record there it stands now, that we were willingly to die for black people, for an independent black state, Botswana. How can I feel myself responsible? I, my friend, I have to answer myself and the voices in me, the voice of my people.
During the attack on the Mercedes, the Volksfront men had remained at the airbase.
They stayed there while our people were murdered and we were attacked, and late in the afternoon they slipped away.
Dis ook nadat daai onttrekking plaasgevind het, né? Wat daar finaal besluit is dat daar is nie meer sin daaraan as ons daar sou bly nie.
The government now decided to get rid of Mangope. The ANC assigned a top man to ensure that this was done. He was Mac Maharaj, a member of the Transitional Council.
The basis of
6 years before, when Mangope was the South African government's favorite tribal ruler, they had rescued him from a coup. Now, deferring to Bop's foreign status, the foreign minister, Pik Botha, was sent to depose him.
We boarded a plane, flew to what was known in the old days as Mafeking, Mabatu now, and from there flew to President Mangope's residence in a helicopter at night.
We got to Mangope's late at night. We were aware that he was guarded by at least 60 bodyguards, all well armed.
And it was my duty to put it to President Mangope in a friendly, courteous but firm way that, look, Mr. President, it's over. And you can still participate in the elections. But you cannot simply sit here in your private residence while people are dying.
I intervened to say that the central feature of the situation was that the administration has collapsed. The public refused to acknowledge his administration's authority.
You know, Mr. Pik Botha came accompanied by Mr. Maharaj, who apparently came to ensure that Mr. Botha carried out his instructions, Mr. Maharaj's instructions.
Mangope refused to even address me, but realized that the game was up, and he then expressed extreme disquiet and with Pik Botha, said he felt betrayed by Pik Botha.
He then asked whether he could not address his people, and I said it would serve no purpose. It's gone.
They would not allow me to address my people and tell them that I had told Botha, that I had told Maharaj, that they do not have the right to remove me. They have no legal or constitutional right to remove me. They would not allow me that.
The delegation reported to their political superiors.
Mangope was very arrogant when they went to tell him that he should resign, and that if he does not resign, he would then be ordered to resign. And then he was very arrogant, and they told him that now, from now on, you are no longer president of Botswana. He then, of course, broke down and collapsed. And once a statement was made that Mangope had been deposed, then, of course, the right wing itself collapsed.
Only one threat to a peaceful transition remained, but it was a dangerous one: KwaZulu. Chief Buthelezi got his IFP, the Inkatha Freedom Party, ready to enforce a boycott of the elections. He wanted KwaZulu and the surrounding province of Natal to have rights that were not included in the agreed constitution.
There was a demand for what really amounted to a form of almost full independence for the Zulu kingdom.
It was made more complex, I think, by Inkatha insisting on, in my opinion, powers for the provinces, including Natal, which were really in effect tantamount to become a totally independent state.
The government and the ANC rejected these demands. Violence between Buthelesi's supporters and those of the ANC escalated, with hundreds killed each month. The big question was whether in Natal the election could be held at all. In one incident there, 15 young ANC election workers were killed. Mandela went to see Buthelezi.
The essence of my appeal to him was that whoever was wrong or right at the beginning, history will indict us for having failed to stop the slaughter of our own people. And the only thing that we can do now is to unite and to take part in the elections.
I'm not devious by nature. God didn't make me that way. So when I said we're not going to participate, I meant that we're not going to participate. Simple as that.
On March 28th, Inkatha supporters staged an anti-election march through Johannesburg to the ANC headquarters. There was sporadic shooting along the way. Then a volley was fired into the crowd from the ANC building. Altogether, more than 50 people died. Buthelezi said the massacre marked the start of a struggle to the end between the ANC and the Zulu nation. As passions became further inflamed in Buthelezi's home territory, President de Klerk, with Mandela's backing, intervened.
Circumstances have arisen within the province of Natal which seriously threaten the safety of the public and the maintenance of public order. I have therefore decided to declare, in terms of the Public Safety Act of 1953, a state of emergency in the area mentioned.
Buthelezi now demanded that the election be postponed so that international mediators could be brought in. He wanted them to settle his demands for an autonomous Natal.
The election couldn't be postponed. You had millions of people who had focused on these election days as the days of liberation. And you couldn't say postpone the day of liberation because the IFP and Chief Buthelezi are not yet ready.
The government, which had moved troops into KwaZulu, would not budge. And with less than a month to go before the election, Buthelezi was faced with a stark decision if he continued to hold out.
There was a realization on the side of Inkatha that not participating faced them with a major choice, and that would be the choice of going to the bush. And that they realized, because the leadership of Inkatha, I sincerely believe, didn't want war and doesn't want war, that would lead them into a situation of declaring a form of war.
If he didn't squeeze into the process in that last 10 days, he would be completely and utterly eliminated from the political scene.
In a last-minute move, de Klerk and Mandela made a few face-saving offers.
They agreed also that as soon as possible after elections, that there would be international mediation. It was on that basis. Because then, for me, from the point of view of a politician, it was very stupid of me at that point, without canvassing, without voter education, without any money, to then undertake to participate in an election, even a few days' time. But I had no excuse whatsoever for not doing so.
With 8 days to go, a great burden of fear slipped away. The threat of the country descending into chaos at last receded. Inkatha, the election's last formidable opponent, would participate. To add them to the ballot, 80 million stickers had to be printed. More than 19 million people voted. The ANC won 63%, the National Party 20%, Inkatha 10%. De Klerk, who became the second of 2 deputy presidents, reflected on the transition he had initiated.
4 years and 3 months ago, I said in Parliament that the time had come.
He claimed his original objectives had been fulfilled.
We have seen the end of discrimination. We have equality before the law. Minority rights have been secured.
When de Klerk made his speech on the 2nd February 1990, he thought that by unbanning the ANC, he would be able to control political events in our country. I don't believe that he knew that he was actually unleashing a force which he would find far, far, far beyond his own political imagination and control.
On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as the first president of the new Republic of South Africa. The whole world came to Pretoria, the capital which for half a century had been an international outcast. New ministers, allies, and former rivals were all in attendance. Mandela's government was formed in line with Joe Slovo's Sunset Clause compromise. Slovo himself, by now gravely ill, was in the cabinet.
I never really worked out in my mind whether I would or wouldn't live to see it. But I thought always that it was within the realm of possibility that I would live to see the transformation that has taken place. I feel that we can all leave this earth in peace, having achieved what we have achieved.
Joe Slovo died on January 6, 1995, 8 months after Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as the first president of a truly democratic South Africa.